welcome everyone to this webinar, Achieving Net Zero, Decarbonising the UK Housing Stock. This is the latest thinking and research on achieving net zero. I'll just do a couple of quick introductions. So I'm Karen Brown, I'm from the Northern Housing Consortium, and we've got 3 speakers with us today for 2 presentations. We'll hear both of those presentations first, which should take about 30 minutes or so, and then there'll be an opportunity for everyone to ask questions. So please use the Q&A function on Zoom, or raise your hand if you want to ask your question yourself. Otherwise, I can ask your question for you. Just to make everyone aware, we are recording this session. I'll just do a quick introduction to all of our speakers today. So welcome to Professor Ken Gibb. He's the Director of the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, and he'll be talking on retrofitting traditional Scottish tenements to NFIT standards, and that's a partnership-based demonstration project and evaluation. We've then got 2 speakers who are talking on the dynamic simulation of the housing stock to support decarbonisation transition, and that's welcome to Professor Darren Robinson. He's Chair of Architectural and Urban Science at the University of Sheffield, and Dr. Gustavo Sousa, who's a Research Fellow at the School of Architecture, University of Sheffield. And Gustavo has more than 10 years experience in housing stock energy performance analysis, with a PhD in analysis strategies to decarbonise the UK housing stock. He's evaluated the attributes of previous national housing stock energy models, and has developed the dynamic housing stock energy model platform NHub. And Darren has worked for 2 decades on multi-scale building energy modelling and simulation, and most recently he's worked on the development of NHub with Gustavo. So I'm looking forward to hearing that presentation. But firstly, I'm going to hand over to Professor Ken Gibb, who's going to talk to us about retrofitting traditional Scottish tenements to NFIT standards. So Ken, over to you.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to just share my screen and get started. So thanks very much, Karen. Right, as just said, I want to talk about the opportunity created by the need for retrofit across existing housing stock, and do that through the lens of a specific demonstration project and the evaluation of that, which is what we are involved in. So let me start by thinking about context a little bit. I don't think any of us can fail to be struck by the real momentum and drive that is now emerging about finding solutions to tackle the achieving net zero in the existing housing stock. It's becoming a well sort of known phrase that most of our housing that exists today will dominate the housing stock in the 2040s. So it's critical that we find effective solutions involving the existing stock as opposed to necessarily the new build sector. So this is primarily about the retrofit of energy systems and also the renewal of the fabric of the existing stock, but it does go beyond insulation, as I'll talk about in a few minutes. And I think there are some really big delivery questions, implementation questions for the policies that are now being discussed and the funds that are now being made available. How is this all going to be delivered, and how's it going to be paid for? And by that I mean, how does the public sector contributions, the public finance, as it were, that's used, how does that interact with the range of financial incentives and actual direct payments that individual citizens, householders, occupiers and asset owners are going to have to fund? Additionally to that, what we're really talking about is a new industry emerging out of existing parts of the built environment professions and practice, and it's evident talking to a number of people who are involved in low carbon energy retrofitting sector that there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, which is about when it is that the levels of demand for retrofit activity kind of overcome the reluctance of the supply side in the construction sector in particular to really have the capacity to deliver what's required on the scale that's required. And that's also holding back the training of the required skilled staff, you know, to make this actually happen. So there's a kind of tipping point that we haven't got to yet, as it were. And I know certainly in Scotland, many people who are strategically involved in policy to try to deliver retrofit are very concerned about where and when that capacity will emerge. And underlying all of that is a sense that we need to really have evidence. We need to have learning about what works, and we need to think about what of these pieces of knowledge can actually be scaled up. So there clearly is a great opportunity for the sector to try to deliver an energy efficient carbon reduction through retrofit of the stock. And there is, as I say, extensive state support emerging. There's also things happening in a complementary fashion. The Green Finance Institute are developing a whole range of products and ideas to support the delivery and funding of energy efficient retrofit. Think tanks like the IPPR have been championing a national programme of rolling out air source heat pumps and the like. And I think there are various entrepreneurs and analysts talking about the range of business opportunities here, both the installation capital work, but also the kind of revenue basis of maintaining and looking after the installation of retrofit activities once it's actually done. So it's a really interesting time. It seems to be moving very quickly, but there are real challenges. So it's in that context that I want to talk about Glasgow and its tenement housing. So Glasgow is a city which visually looks like a city of pre-1919 tenements, and there's something like 70,000 such units, largely around the inner south and north of the River Clyde, although they are spread elsewhere. They also make up a lot of core traditional housing in other parts of Scotland. So something like 25% of urban Scotland is housed in tenements. So they're not all these pre-1919 sandstone tenements, which are so typical of Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee, Aberdeen, and many of the smaller towns across the country. These are porous, so they do create real problems for carbon reduction. Glasgow, of course, next year is hosting the delayed COP26 conference, and there is, as you might imagine, considerable buy-in at the city region, the Scottish Government and the UK Government, as well as wider public, private, professional and academic interests in the whole retrofit and climate change agenda. And a number of people have come to the view that because the tenement built form is so challenging, and that's something I'm going to come back to my final slide, there's some really interesting questions that have to be overcome. So I should just say that the photograph you can see there is of an 8 one-bedroom flat close in the south side of Glasgow, and that is the project that we're actually doing, which I'm just about to talk about. So how did this project come about? And the first thing to say is we have to carefully distinguish between the construction project, which is refurbishing and retrofitting those 8 one-bedroom units, and the evaluation, which is what I am leading. It's the evaluation that we hope is going to provide learning and replicable learning that can help Glasgow, the brand, as it were, find ways to retrofit as much of its tenement stock as is possible. So it came about because of a Scottish funding council, who are essentially HEFCA in Scotland, the HEFCA version in Scotland. They held a climate emergency call, and they funded 2 research projects, which were meant to be about partnership, knowledge exchange, relevance to the economy, as well as making a significant difference to carbon reduction. And we ultimately won such a project, and we started at the end of February 2020, winning, and you can see the size of the project there. There was about another 50% added on to that in terms of in-kind support. So the retrofit is of 8 one-bedroom flats in this pre-1919 tenement in the inner south side of the city. It's a social housing tenement close. The properties are empty because it's just been transferred from a private landlord. That means that we're in the fortunate but understandably rare situation where we've got complete control of the property, and the scope to do flexible forms of retrofit are really wide open to us, and we can maximise the kind of shared learning, we hope. So why did we succeed? Why did we get funded? I think it's an inherently practical and useful project. The scale of it means that the scale of the issue means that hopefully there is learning from the property and the work that goes forward. We're very keen to mobilise that knowledge as far as we can. We think that there's really interesting issues about what works here, but also what doesn't work. As I'll say, and of course we have COP26 in the background, and also a sense that this project invokes a new collaborative partnership of people from different sectors in order to who seek to make this work, and that again may say something about the kind of business opportunities that there are. So this maybe give you a flavour for the kind of work that's being done. This is a model of the property. It's looking at the back of the property. The back of the property is nearest us, with the front of the property to the right hand side. You can see there'll be windows in the cutout. So these show 4 of the units of the 8, as I say, 1-bedroom flats with the bathrooms at the back. So there's a number of dimensions to the retrofit. It's about external insulation, and it's about internal wall insulation. It's about mechanical ventilation, heat recovery. It's about wastewater heat recovery as well. There's issues to do with the front sandstone and how it gets repaired. It won't be altered. We won't alter the front of the building at all. There's plans to change the layout, and we don't actually say anything definitive there about the heat systems that are going to be used, and I'll come back to that towards the end. So the leading architects who are leading the project are John Gilbert Architects, or conservation architects in Scotland. Southside Housing Association are the community-based housing association who own the property and who lead the project. The academics involved are ourselves and Cash, but also architects at the University of Strathclyde. The City Council has put a lot of funding together for this, alongside the rents that, of course, tenants will ultimately pay for it. And CCG are the construction firm who are leading the actual delivery of the programme. And as I say, there's a refurbishment project going forward. These properties were built, I think, in the 1890s. They've already had some renovation, but not for many, many decades. You may know that in Glasgow, in the 70s and 80s, most of the tenemental stock which wasn't owned was transferred in pieces to housing associations, community-based housing associations. There's now more than 40 of them. So there was a major investment in refurbishment of the tenemental stock in the 70s and 80s, but that's now 40 years ago, and the properties need a further round of that investment. Our evaluation's really got 5 elements to it. We've done what we call an evaluability assessment, where you bring the different stakeholders together so that you can share a kind of common theory of change about what you're trying to achieve, and so that everybody can understand what the others' objectives are, really, and we can hopefully work towards a better model of what the evaluations ought to be, so they're as much use as possible. 4 basic evaluations are underway. We have a kind of what we call an action research project, where we're just trying to record, monitor and understand critical juncture decision making as we go along. Secondly, we are trying to contrast the theory and practice of how we expect the building's performance to change. So in our bid, we did some desk-based analysis of the carbon reduction, but we're going to use monitoring equipment and a range of other tools to do that in practice. The thing that I'm most centrally involved in are the financials. So we're going to do a kind of financial appraisal of the cost effectiveness of the project, looking at the actual costs and how they operate in practice. That's more of a qualitative exercise, but we're also going to do a cost benefit analysis, which is going to try to explicitly, in an orthodox economics way, understand the cost, the monetized value of the carbon reductions, the costs of the work over time, and also take account of the options. What happens if you didn't do this investment? What's the do nothing option? What would be the cost in terms of carbon, etc., in doing that? And finally, we're also trying to scale all this up. What can we scale up? What lessons can we learn? What things are transferable and what things aren't? And as you can imagine, what I've already said, the context of the project means there are some very unique aspects to the project. So this is my last slide. There are a number of challenges in doing this. I mean, the most obvious one, your ears may have pricked up when I said that the project started at the end of February. So 3 weeks later, we had lockdown and construction stopped for several months. That also meant that many of our partners working stopped or was held up or had to be reprioritized. So it's actually taken us a lot longer to get funding, planning permission, building control, all of that sorted out. It's all now sorted out, but we're now running approximately 9 months late on everything. But we're all now good to go. But that has major implications in what we do, but actually positively as well, because it's allowed us to sort of sit down with the partners and work on a regular basis about what we really want to achieve out of this. So actually, I think that's been a great benefit. Path to penalty is very important in all this. Because we're dealing with existing housing stock, we're kind of constrained in the neighbourhood, the type of building that you have to work with. All those things will vary, but they will greatly condition what you can actually do. At a broader level, I think one of the challenges is that a lot of this is about prevention. We're trying to deliver retrofit, which will both reduce carbon emissions dramatically, but will also secure really major improvements in affordable warmth. But you know, trouble with prevention is that payback varies as to when it starts to make a profit. The incentive impacts are different on different partners. Sometimes preventative spend, however admirable, is difficult to achieve. I think we're probably all familiar with examples of that. Probably the most distinctive challenge about tenemental housing is basically the law of tenements and how tenements work. So there's a real challenge to get people who are liable for common repairs to pay for these repairs. So we have factoring systems with more or less effectiveness in how they work. We have different classes of owners of the tenement: private landlords, owner-occupiers, social landlords. All of those things create a whole set of issues about dealing with maintenance work, aside from the retrofit, but the same things. This multiple ownership challenge also clearly applies to the retrofit work we want to do. And there's a whole set of issues around affordability. For social landlords, one of our issues, of course, is we really don't want tenants to end up paying for the retrofit, or at least only to pay for a small share of that cost. So there's a whole set of issues around budgets, about public funding, about private loans, all of those sorts of things. And we have to find ways through that. We have to think about incentives. That Green Finance Institute work I talked about earlier is an interesting way forward with that, but we need to keep this all under cost control as far as we can. It could be very expensive, but we also have to think about the users and the occupiers and the owners, and how this can be done in a way which is incentivizes them too. And one of the really striking early learning lessons from our doing this work is that there are lots of trade-offs, and really we shouldn't imagine that the first best outcomes are going to be what happens. There are a whole number of dimensions to this. What's technically the best thing to do? What's an efficient way of reducing energy? What's an efficient way of producing the energy that is affordable? What are the institutional constraints you face, the politics that you confront, the planning system, heritage and conservation? All of these things mean that you find a way through which works, but often it may not be what your first best optimal solution would have been. But provided you're still in the EnerFit passive house scale, if that's what your target is, then you may end up making a series of trade-offs. So we found that with the heating system choice. We all know that gas boilers are being phased out. We actually have a tenement block with 8 gas boilers in it, and we're thinking about the range of alternative modes of heating system that we might work. That creates other trade-offs because the planners don't like there being boxes on the external wall at the back of the property, so we need to find other ways to do that, and that's still things we're trying to sort out at the margin. And that's just one example of these kind of trade-offs. My final sentence really is, I think that we're only now in the construction phase. there's still a lot of decisions to be made, but we recognise that the specificity of any one demonstration project means that not everything can be scaled up, but we need to be able to identify that. But we are sure that there will be many things about the fabric, the heating systems, and just the process of going through this that will have tremendous value for other owners of tenements and for the city as we go forward. And I'll stop at that point. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Ken. That was really interesting, and we're starting to get some questions coming in for you. We'll take questions after we've heard the second presentation, but I won't lose any of the questions. So everyone who's started to post them in the Q&A, we'll take those. So while Gustavo and Darren are getting ready, I don't know whether you're doing slides or not, but I'll introduce your presentation anyway. So this is Gustavo and Darren are going to talk about the dynamic simulation of housing stock to support decarbonisation transition. And this is highlighting the major issues to address for the transition towards decarbonisation and to support the policies and strategies needed for that sector. So thank you. I can see your presentation now. So Gustavo and Darren, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Karen. So I'm going to try to whip through my slides. I'm just providing a little bit of context to set up Gustavo for his talk with all the clever stuff about housing stock energy models. So I'm sure that many of you are already aware of the policy context and some of the factors that have led to recent policies. So we continue to break records. In 2018, we saw a new record for global carbon dioxide concentration. This year looks set to be one of the 3 warmest years on record. So those factors led to the 21st Conference of Parties meeting in Paris, at which the Paris Climate Change Agreement was signed. And the intention there is to limit global temperature rise to about 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. We're currently at about 1.1 degrees Celsius already. Current policies and targets suggest that we are on target to massively surpass that that intended level of global warming to between 2.5 and 3 degrees Celsius. Fortunately, China has renewed its commitments. It's looking with the new president-elect in the US that the US will, so hopefully we'll end up being closer to this optimistic target of 2 degrees Celsius, and who knows, I may be stunned to see that we achieve our 1.5 degrees Celsius target. With respect to the UK, then we have our, apologies, we have our 2008 Climate Change Act that was amended in 2019 so that we are committed now to achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. And we've agreed with Europe to try to achieve a 68% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions by 2030. But with years of inactivity, we're currently a long way from achieving that target. We do now, in recognition of this, have Boris's 10-point plan to get us back on track. Cambridge Econometrics suggests that we're some way short of achieving our 2030 target, even with Boris's 10-point plan. And personally, it's as a personal view, I think that that even that is rather optimistic, given that we're entering into a rather deep and long recession. So a few words on Boris's 10-point plan. I mean, there are 3 key components in the context of this talk. So the first is decarbonising the power sector through offshore wind, through more investments in small and large scale nuclear, and through carbon capture and storage of those power stations that, that will not have been decommissioned by 2030, that are using fossil fuels. Pertinent to this talk is greener buildings, both new and existing buildings, so renovating existing buildings to improve their EPC. And really importantly, and as mentioned by Ken, our green financing initiatives to support these investments. So how is the UK housing stock performing now? Well, the energy use of the UK housing stock is actually greater than it was 50 years ago in 1970. There are a number of factors that have contributed to that. So one is simply that, well, there are more houses or more housing units. Also, we've seen a widespread uptake of central heating systems. Those have been gas powered. So here we see that we've had a reduction in the use of coal, and that's been through substitution of coal fires to gas-fired central heating systems. We've also seen a recent reduction in lighting energy use, but that's been compensated for by an increase in appliance energy use. So all in all, we haven't really achieved a great deal at the scale of the UK housing stock. I realise that this is a really, really busy slide. This is an infographic prepared by one of my PhD students quite recently. But there are 3 rings in this infographic that I want to talk about. So the inner ring explains the proportion of the housing stock that's comprised of different typologies. So we've got about 28% of our housing stock, which is comprised of terraced housing, and around 30% of semi-detached, about 70% of detached, and so on. The outer ring indicates the carbon dioxide emissions on average of a housing unit that belongs to that typology. And the third ring, with lots of different colours, indicates the proportion of that typology which has a given EPC rating. And so it's fairly straightforward to see from this infographic that EPC ratings of A and B are like gold dust. That for detached, semi-detached and terraced housing units, likewise converted flats, that 80 to 90% of EPC ratings are D and upwards. We do find relatively high proportions of EPC ratings of C amongst purpose-built flats, whether they be low or high rise. But for all other typologies, yeah, D ratings and upwards are absolutely dominant. So as the remark states, we have close to the worst performing housing stock in Europe, and yet we have rather stringent targets for decarbonising the housing stock. So we simply have a very long way to go. Matt Lipson at the Energy Systems Catapult has conducted some analysis. And so here you see that, for example, with respect to loft insulation, that at the level of today, so that's the third column, that loft insulation has received relatively large penetration. Indicated in light grey is where there is still opportunity, but there may be issues of, so practical issues of disruption that limit the penetration of loft insulation. If any of you are like me, you've got junk in your loft and it's simply difficult to insulate the loft in those circumstances. Cavity walls have been largely insulated already, and they are relatively, that is relatively affordable. Likewise, double glazing has been largely exploited. That I find astonishing because it really never pays back. But of course, there are other factors like sound, condensation, and deterioration of frames that motivate glazing replacements. Condensing boilers also have been, relatively well exploited so far. But as Ken hinted at, and as I suggested earlier, with the electrification of the decarbonisation of the power system, then we are going to see an emphasis placed towards low carbon heating technologies, particularly things like air and ground source heat pumps. Particularly challenging, I think, is going to be how we go about improving the integrity of the envelope, the thermal integrity of the envelope of pre-1930s housing. So particularly pre-1919 housing, which is largely solid masonry. And the challenge here, I think, is going to be balancing technical issues relating to how you go about insulating whilst avoiding condensation and associated mold growth with heritage concerns. So there are going to be many instances housing where we don't want to insulate externally, we'd rather do that internally. But that, of course, brings lots of core bridging issues. Or even if we were to insulate externally, there are some geometries of Victorian type housing, for example, that is just very, very complicated and correspondingly expensive. So, so the situation is complex. For me, the million-dollar question is how we go about determining not where potential lies, but what the probable outcomes, what the probable decarbonisation impacts are going to be of different policy and regulatory interventions. Crucially for me, to be able to answer that question, we need to have some form of household decision-making mechanism integrated or coupled with our energy modelling capabilities. And that needs to address both owner-occupiers, but also private and social landlords. And of course, they have different needs and different incentives. And so we need to discriminate between those, and that's complicated. As part of that, then we need to account for changes in household composition. So what's the population going to look like in 2030, in 2050? Crucially, we also need to link our representation of housing typologies with household typologies. And in that, we need to account for household size, the socioeconomic circumstances of the household. And that, of course, determines the kind of housing that they occupy, but also the affordability of decarbonisation investments. And when a household does decide to invest, or a landlord decides to invest, well, how are the co-benefits being shared? So are we seeing similar indoor temperatures, and so the full potential for decarbonisation realised? Or are we seeing, and as is relatively likely, a sharing of the benefits between reduced energy use and emissions, but also improved comfort conditions through raised indoor temperatures? And finally, we also want to account for the impacts of the future climate on energy use in housing. So we know that we're heading towards a relatively warmer future. That's going to mean that we have lower demands for space heating. But with a warmer future, particularly when we combine a warmer general climate with heat waves, then we will see increased incidence of overheating risk and premature deaths brought about under those circumstances. So in a nutshell, what we really need to do now is to combine physical simulation with social simulation so that we can account for the dynamics of the housing stock and the likelihood or the likely impacts of decarbonisation policy measures and regulatory interventions. But before we do that, of course, we need to make sure that we're reinforcing the kind of the rigor with which we conduct our physical simulations of the housing stock. And so at that point, I'll pass on to Gustavo, if I may.
Okay, so yeah, Darren is right. We need models to support our policies, and we need models capable enough to represent both the current situation and also the future of the stock, considering that this is a dynamic, evolving housing stock. So now this chart to start. So over the past 40 years or so, there have been about 30 models developed in the UK, represented in color. And there have been policies, schemes, programs aiming at improving the energy efficiency of the stock. Yet, despite all these efforts, well, we are not currently on target. Now, some of these models are closely related to the policy instruments shown below and also the official statistics. So, for example, we got BRIDAM, which is actually used by other models, and it's been used to support different schemes or to the release of the domestic energy fact file. Another key example is here, the reduced version of SAP that provided the basis for the EPCs. Also, we've got, and this is the last model I will talk about, is the CHM. That's perhaps the most comprehensive and reliable model that was used to describe the contribution of services and fuels. So those shown in Darren's slide about the evolution of the stock. So in summary, we reviewed these models. Actually, we did it a few years ago, and we identified that the majority of them are physical models, that they rely on steady state algorithms. So this means that they do not consider changes over time, or that they just oversimplify this, and they don't estimate indoor temperature. They are not open source, or they are not prepared to be amended, and some of the assumptions of the models are not declared, and they are mostly dependent to one single data source. So if you got new data, see that this cannot be used. Now, considering these characteristics, so can we trust them? Can we use these models? So can we really indicate what is happening across the stock? So currently, all these models are useful because they provide a snapshot of the stock, and we can use them to understand how it performs. But as mentioned, they are focused on the physical, and some of them have provided data, additional data. Statistical models have provided data about the evolution of the stock and the transformation, but broadly they fail to indicate how this transition might look in practice. And actually, that explains why there is still a debate on the usability of EPCs, or the most effective interventions. So we may only respond to all these issues if our models provide certainty and trust. So we can do this by checking and questioning what is being represented in the models. So if we can validate algorithms and results, we can be more confident about our interventions or measures. I mean, that sounds logical, but if we want to achieve these features, we need to make them scalable and flexible. So we need to be able to see what happens over time at different scales. So this includes what happens with the individuals, and also what happens to the housing transformation. I mean, it's important to see this to what happens in a local or in a snapshot, but over time, that's the key thing. So models should be dynamic. And one proven approach to do this has been through open source understanding. So this is what we have been doing. The NHub, the Housing Stock Energy Hub, started as a novel platform capable to represent all these indoor energy performance in detail. So it uses modular architecture so that each algorithm can be validated, scrutinized, and amended. It uses open data, which facilitates using or to make regular updates. And yes, as with the CHM model, we adapted the English Housing Survey initially, but actually, what we've got with NHub is that it can transcend to different scales. So it's not only about the stock, so the national stock. It can be adapted to very specific stock. So a stock, for example, a neighborhood, or a city, or a district. So now to obtain a more detailed representation of our models, we needed a volumetric representation of houses with which to evaluate the distribution of heat, or this performance. So we made this by creating some volumetric representation. So this was by stacking cubes or cuboids, so that we could represent the impact of an attachment or the distribution of loads in the function of the geometry. So this also helped to consider, for example, the orientation and a more detailed account for surfaces. So with this 3D representation of houses, we were thus able to simulate the stock dynamically. Now this is a less abstract representation of our geometries. So this shows two examples how they look like for the simulation. Now all the internal properties, so these about materials, occupants, heating systems, everything is contained in the simulation file. So it looks quite simplistic in the beginning, but it has everything. Now each group of these properties is processed in a modular way, and that's the important thing. So for example, here we can look at the modularity of NHub with a view to the heating system. Now, let me describe some key areas of this. So here the blue box indicates a part of what we call the management of open data that is used to define the archetypes and to provide values to our internal processes or the modules. Now the orange box here performs some validation and calibration of our data, and then provides the inputs to each of the modules. And then this purple box shows that we can process a catalog of predefined components in some cases. So in this case of energy systems, but then we can look at each of these components and then edit them. So in this way, we can have an in-depth look to each of the modules and their components, and we can question really what is being considered, and required we can change it. So let's see what's, for example, the energy system. So this is just a representation of the heating, of the typical central heating. And we can see this diagram. So here we represent every component of the heating system, and it is represented explicitly. Now, I mean, you need to trust me in this, but every component is then assigned to each internal zone of the house or to each surface. So then we've got this volume, this cuboid. Then for each surface, we can assign the heating, so the position of the heating, and then we can analyze how this heat is released and what have its impacts in general. And I mean, all this helps wonders really, because we can test full system substitution, so testing these components, and more importantly, we can quantify the resulting indoor temperature. So this is another main use of NHOB. We can quantify the effect of different interventions. So let's start with the chart on the top right. So here we can see, well, the y-axis indicates the energy intensity, and then the axis is the total floor area, the accumulated floor area. So the total represents the total energy demand of the stock in this case. Now, if we consider this first typology, so say a Victorian house, so with the orange rectangle, we represent what would be a conditional intervention, so that there are some, or that it is limited by some of the typical barriers that we find, such as hard to treat areas, or we can consider if the disposable income is significantly restricted, so the intervention of an investment is just unlikely. Or if there has been an intervention in the past, so for example, moving from F to D, then the transition to C or B, that's again unlikely. Or if the lofts are being utilized, so things that in practice that present a barrier for a transition. Now the red one represents what would be a perfect intervention. So that's the adoption of the best technology of improving all the envelope, reducing infiltration and the like. And so we can see that even if we take this approach, or we combine everything, there remains a significant amount of energy that cannot be reduced in this way. So this means that we need to look at the interventions, so make more, to look at the energy system substitution. Or linked to this, we can consider the supply side. Now, the chart on the left, so with the bars, we represent how we can accumulate different interventions. So each category actually represents one of these interventions. So say wall insulation is one, or loft insulation, draft proofing, the efficiency of appliances, etc. And then we can combine them. So in this case, for example, SB, it should be 1, 3, not 13, meaning that we combine 1 and 3, and then we can see what happens. So we can combine all of them. So more importantly with this chart is that we can overlap and see what happens in the performance, which is not always evident when using these typical or simple evaluations. And it helps to have a slightly more realistic representation of what an intervention might be. So now in this figure, it's a similar approach from the representation, the typologies, but in this case representing heating systems. Being the larger one, the central one, the conventional central heating with gas. And here we can test the large scale substitutions. So we can pick different systems. So in this case, we have the example of replacing everything with district heating, and then we can achieve an approximate reduction of 20%. Or if we consider ground source heat pumps, where we estimate about 50%, but we also know that we are replacing gas with electricity. So we're also improving that supply, and then we assume that that supply of the electricity is cleaner. So for this final diagram, I just want to highlight that we are now in position of performing a more rigorous representation of indoor performance. So this is what the models have done or currently achieve. So this is the physical, with some extent the evolution of some changes of the stock, and then we are able to also represent the improvements in comfort and also carbon. So we've got more detailed indoor conditions here. And but actually we're actually working with or we are processing survey data with which to integrate everything. So to integrate the social simulation capabilities into our energy model, and then we will be able to represent all these interactions and feedbacks. So that will make our models a bit more trustable. So just to conclude, so yes, models are essential, but we also need to change the way that we use them and we develop them. We need to link the physical with the social. And for this, we need to enable different mechanisms. So those to represent investments and decisions, and more important, to translate these policies and regulations into probable impacts. And yes, so we can not only forecast them, but we can actually challenge or update our estimations. So for this, we need evidence. So NHOP is being developed to provide this evidence-based in support to the whole decarbonization policy. And yep, that would be everything. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gustavo. There's a question just come in for you. Can you confirm that air leakage or air tightness was included in the model?
Yes, it was. Although, yes, we also consider some, or we took some assumptions on that, but we did consider the air leakage.
Thanks.
Can I just remark on that? So we do have some data to enable us to model the distribution of infiltration rates as a function of typology. But what we really lack evidence in is what is likely to happen following different interventions to improve the integrity of the envelope. That sort of evidence really is missing.
Okay, thanks. Can I ask a question on the supply chain? And this might mainly be for Ken, but for anyone really. And there's a question coming about it, but I had my own question as well in terms of the mismatch, I suppose, in the supply chain for both components and skills. And I think, Ken, in your presentation, you talked about the chicken and egg and the tipping point. And there's a number of questions within this. Is the finance around this tipping us over? Is it actually creating that stimulus? Because without the supply of components or the right skills, for instance, to install heat pumps, we're just not going to achieve scalability at all. And there's a huge question in that, and there's a number of different aspects to it. So I suppose I'll start with Ken, but then I'll come to Darren and Gustavo.
Well, I think it's the critical challenge of the moment, really. I've been to a lot of events and spoken to a lot of people in the last 6 months who've kind of raised this again and again, and I imagine that probably a useful way to think about this is to think about other examples in kind of industrial economic development where innovation is scaled up in a quick way, and the role in which, the extent to which the public sector leads that, either through funding or regulation or kind of policy development to make that happen. I was in an event yesterday where somebody was arguing that very strongly, that was the only way to make this happen. But clearly, it's one of these situations where demand is what creates supply, rather than the other way around, I think. And that has to be, certainly at least in part, led by the state. Certainly in the case of area we're looking at in Glasgow, the local state is trying to play as big a role in that as it can do. It's trying to facilitate and enable the sector to come in, but there seems to be capacity issues. There's just only a limited number of firms who seem to have the appetite for it just now on at any scale. So that's a real challenge. And the other thing, as you say, is that the skills issues require there to be the jobs direct. It's one thing to say there's a need for this thing. It's quite another thing to say that there are firms who will have positions and they need the skills right now to do these things. So all of these things have to move in the same direction at the same time. And yeah, it's clearly going to be uneven. But I think, as with most of these things, if that commitment is as strong as people are saying it is, then there is going to have to be more action, and we will probably see quicker development in some places rather than in others. I think the other interesting about the kit and the components is there's again an awful lot going on just now. I'm involved in two other projects just now. One about an innovative air source heat pump, which is all about scalability, but it's a 3-year research council project which hasn't started yet. It may not get funded, but that's got quite a long timeline and quite a long process ahead of it. There's also another project about geothermal access to underwater mining and trying to develop larger projects through that as well, which is a huge program of work involving many people. So there's all those things. But the interesting thing I was trying to say was it's often been said in things I've been involved recently that we should be using more standardized approaches and off-site modular construction for retrofits specifically. And I think that seems to me to be really challenging actually as well. I was kind of quizzical about how that's supposed to work. We certainly would struggle with the kind of variety and heterogeneity of even the tenemental stock in Glasgow to understand how you could go about that. There's clearly some scope for it. There's undoubtedly some components that it may be significant for, but not for an awful lot. It just isn't. So again, demand has to create supply, I think.
You might not know the answer to this, but are we close to the tipping point in your view? You don't have to answer because it's all conjecture.
I think there's too many moving parts to be able to really answer that. But I do think there is a lot of resource that seems to be out there. There seems to be a lot of funding and a lot of different models that are coming online, both at a UK level and a Scottish level. And I would have thought that there's certainly opportunity for bigger demonstration projects, perhaps at a larger settlement level or something like that. You know, if there was a new build settlement, you could imagine a much greater use of different heating technologies, for instance. But otherwise, I can't really answer it as you say.
Darren, do you want to add to that?
I'm probably going to answer a question with a question, so I apologise. But I wonder whether there's the potential to combine, as Ken was suggesting, relatively large-scale demonstration projects with the achievement of some kind of local regionalised training hubs. The Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund might provide such a mechanism so that social housing providers perhaps could lead the way. Yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And actually, I know that it's often the social sector that seems to lead with these things because it's more controllable and directable in a sense, and that's where a lot of the learning actually comes from. It is worth saying that the context is very different in the sense that, as in my challenge at the moment, we have an empty property and there will all be social tenants in there. There's no issues of multiple ownership or doing work in situ while people are there, all those sorts of issues. But yes, I think, again, I've heard a lot of people saying recently that would be a useful way to proceed. It also, I think, makes sense because you're probably talking about a more functional labour market size to think about training and skills rather than at a national level or a really micro level, and that seems to make sense to me too.
I think it's also quite important to fairly systematically integrate post-occupancy evaluation with these kind of demonstration products, so that, you know, what does work well can be replicated, what doesn't work so well can be spotted and, you know, somehow refined.
This is turning into conversation, but yeah, I completely agree about that. And one of the features of our work is we want to spend quite a long time with the tenants who move in and monitor, but also get a sense of how they're using the retrofit, how they're using it according to the kind of guidance and training that they get, and that post-occupancy thing I think is a really important element.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. If I'll just ask a question about, and I think this might be for Ken again, on the retrofit model. And there's a question coming about the past 2035 model, which is required as the whole house retrofit model. And I suppose this relates to scalability of the work that you've done and whether it's that 2035, past 2035 model.
Yeah, I mean, the question also made the point that Scotland, the Scottish government is still looking at it, I think, but and I should make this point very clearly, if it's not already obvious, I am not a technical building person. I'm a social scientist and an economist originally. I've been learning every day in this project with my colleagues, but as I understand it, my colleague, my partner in this project, who's the lead architect from John Gilbert Architects, they are heavily involved in how to make past 2035 work in Scotland, and they've been working on a range of initiatives to disseminate and support people with it. And their approach in our demonstration project is really one about what work gets done and what standard we achieve has to be able to meet other higher standards going forward. So we are trying to be forward looking in that sense. Similarly, we're trying to achieve an EnerFit passive house standard, and it's perfectly recognizing that many other buildings will not be able to do that, and it'll be too expensive, and there'll be other challenges around it. But it is a demonstration project. We're trying to learn what that means and how that might be used in other contexts and circumstances. So we are trying to do that. But in addition to that, Glasgow City Council has an aspiration to have a retrofit standard unique to Glasgow, which fits with the tenements. So tenements are iconic. They're supposed to be conserved. There's a big heritage element. There's a whole set of challenges that creates, and they're trying to kind of insinuate a standard into that, which meets some, and they basically aspire to the highest standard they can achieve in that. So there's a strong sense about the sustainability of it in adding life. It's not just about achieving something and moving away. It's got to be something which continues to have a real meaning, to extend the life of these properties and make sure that affordable warmth and such like is a real priority. So I can't really go into the details of it because I simply don't understand them. It's not really my part of the project, but I do understand that is the aspiration, that what we're trying to do.
Ken, we've had a number of questions come in, so I'm sort of link them together really in terms of heating sources and the best type of heating source, and Darren and Gustavo might have comment on this as well, but air source heat pumps are being driven at the moment because that's what's there basically, and that's what might get to the tipping point in the components. But how is that set against what might be more appropriate for the property? This is what Darren and Gustavo might comment on as well in terms of ground source heat pumps or other sources of heating. Is it just, are we not using them because the technology is not there? They're just not online yet? So appropriate heating for the building.
So there are a number of things that we could have elaborated on, and time pressures I think prevented that to some extent. So one thing that's really important is that when you're substituting a high temperature heating system with a relatively low temperature heating system, and heat pumps are relatively low temperature systems, that if you don't upgrade the thermal integrity of the envelope and you're left with the same sizes of heat emitters, so the same radiators, then you will not be able to achieve the same standards of indoor temperature. So they really need to be combined together. So you upgrade the integrity of the envelope. If you're going to use the same kind of distribution and emitter infrastructure, then at least by upgrading the envelope, you can compensate for the fact that you're now using a lower temperature supply system. So I think this is why modeling is important, so that you're able to look at the interactions between the envelope and the systems to make sure that comfort expectations are being delivered. In talking with the energy systems catapult as well, I gather that there are some perceptions, both whether they're real or just perceived, I don't know, but perceptions that that some sources, some types of heat pump, some types of air source heat pump are perceived as being relatively noisy, and that this is a barrier to people wanting to invest in heat pumps. But no, I think my main sort of issue is that we need to kind of consider these interventions in a coupled manner.
Ken, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I think this is already mentioned in the comments. So Tony mentions that it's not about the technical potential, but about the post-occupancy of how tenants use this new kit or that installation. And this is actually what we are trying to get with this survey. So to have to reflect on what is the understanding and what is the experience, to positive and negative experience of these new technologies.
I think the other thing I'd say, Karen, is that, as I probably didn't really express very clearly in my presentation, is that I've been really struck by this kind of suboptimal trade-off situation that seems to occur when you're confronted with a real building, you know, with a series of internal and external constraints on what you can do, and some of those constraints are shifting. You know, the policy environment you're working in, what you're allowed to do to the building changes, and you have to try to work out what's the best way to get as far as you can with the targets you're trying to achieve, given that external environment. How can you make it last as long as it can? And at some level, you're trading off the technical efficiency of what the thing does, the cost of what it is, because you've got a budget, and at the end of the day, there's a maximal budget. And I think for social landlords in particular, they're thinking about how much should their tenants be expected to pay for this out of rents, etc. There's the level of subsidy that's involved. There's a whole bunch of those things, but also, I mean, as you probably could tell from you might be able to tell or not from the photograph, but our tenement isn't in a conservation area, though many tenements in Glasgow are, but it's not a kind of conservation area, but it still has really quite powerful planning constraints of what's allowed to be done to it. So you're trying to manage all of those processes. And I'm, you know, as I say, I'm an economist by background, and I'm very comfortable with the whole modelling approach and the evidence and knowledge that gives you to help make better decisions. But it's alive. I mean, certainly in the case we're dealing with, and I think this will be true in many locations, it doesn't scale. It just doesn't scale because you have these different things to trade off, and the real talent of the professionals is to find a way to get as close as, if not to the actual objective, but manage all those different things that have to be traded off. So that's been maybe that's just construction 101. I don't know, but it seems to me I've been really impressed by that, and also that is an additional really major challenge, which is specific to retrofit, I think.
And while you've got the floor, I'll just put this question to you about the U value of different constructions. Yeah. So sandstone on the buildings you worked on and granite in Aberdeen. And there seems to be a gap in understanding that the construction can only be considered as a weather shield. Do you have a view on that?
I must admit, I didn't quite understand that, the point there. I mean, we've basically got an issue in Glasgow. We're trying to protect as many buildings as we can. That's the objective in all of this, to make these not emit carbon as far as we can, but to extend their life, because that's a Glasgow-wide conservation, cultural, economic project. It seemed to be a great opportunity. So the retrofit is trying to certainly get it beyond being a weather shield. They're trying to fix some of the things that are problematic. And as I say, I'm not a technical person, but I do know that joists fit directly into the sandstone, and we're trying to sort that out. So the internal wall insulation at the front of the building is really important to the long-term approach, as is that air tightness thing, which is absolutely essential in all this before you even get onto the heating system. So I may not have got the point of the question, and I apologize if that's the case, but that's the kind of point I've made. Again, make that point that this is only a demonstration project, but we think there's a lot that we can learn from what is essentially a fairly standard building, and typical of what much of the stock looks like.
Yeah.
Hope that helps.
I'm sure if it hasn't helped and Ken's got a further explanation of that, I'm sure he'll post that into the questions. I think can I use my chair's prerogative and ask a question on the modelling if I can? I mean, here in the north of England, the vast majority of our housing is at the upper end of D or the lower end of C. So it seems to me that what modelling can do there for you is to tell you the minimal amount that has to be invested to get to C, and then the clean growth strategy only requires to get to C. So if I can ask the dumb question that any member of the public might ask, will that tell you where it only needs, say, loft insulation or draft proofing, and then you've met that standard?
So one thing that we didn't say in our talk, and that's an oversight, is that although we developed NHub so that it would be a national housing stock model, the architecture of NHub has been set up so that we can create a regional model or even a city model. So we could, for example, put together a northeast housing stock model, and then test fairly specific hypotheses for the typologies from which that stock is comprised. So in direct answer to the question, then yes, we could systematically test different ways of substituting the envelope, of improving the draft sealing of the envelope, and of modifying lights, appliances, indoor systems, and so on, and then be able to kind of prioritize those as a function of cost to identify, where the biggest bang for your buck arises from, and the minimal cost interventions, if you like, that would achieve the transition from one rating to another, or indeed, to C or better.
And did your modelling show that there are some properties that just can't be improved? I mean, are there some older properties that where really nothing is going to get them up to a reasonable energy efficient standard?
Okay, so our model is a dumb model in some ways, in the sense that that we have a geometric abstraction of the reality, and there are some realities that are incredibly geometrically complex, and that geometric complexity, I think, imposes limits, financial limits, on what is really viable, and to some extent technical limits. So there are some, I think there are always going to be specificities that our model is not particularly well equipped to handle, because it's intended to be a stock scale model. And I think there will be always sort of case specific complexities that can only really be addressed in a case specific way, if that answers. It's a bit of a cop out, but.
And there's a question coming in there, aren't there big issues with only getting to EPCC and shifting to lower carbon electric heat in terms of increasing the energy costs and fuel poverty? And obviously this is a very much an issue for social housing in terms of, you could switch everything over to electric heating, but in terms of the costs of the user, it's just unacceptable. Again, it's back to heating choices. I don't know whether any of you want to comment on that.
So I'll just begin, since we're on modelling. So I did say that we would be able to prioritise in terms of where you get the biggest bang for your buck. At the moment, we don't have a costing module in NHub, and that's something important. But of course, there are two factors to this. So one is the construction and renovation cost. And of course, following that, there's the operational cost. And I would hope that we'll, in the future, move to time of use tariffs, so that we have a more granular approach to figuring out what the particularly electrical energy costs are going to be. So I think moving towards the future, then we do need to consider costs, both operational and investment, so that we can better better judge, if you like, the relative value added and improved comfort conditions against, what the cost is in the delivery of that.
Ken, did you have any view on that?
Only insofar as I know one of the questions for the evaluation that we do is the extent to which the fabric improvements in particular reduce the need for heating per se, and that, I know that's about the air tightness and things of that kind, and the quality of the insulation. But that's certainly something we want to test, because I think clearly one of the great prizes in this is being able to reduce the burden of fuel poverty and reduce the cost that people have to pay. And that's a really important part of our evaluation. So I don't have there's no answer to that at this point, but that's certainly something we hope to provide evidence about. And again, I think it goes back to the behaviour of the occupants, of course, and our ability to effectively incentivise and encourage them to make the best use of the unit.
And in general, I would just kind of say, in complement to that, that improving the envelope is the least cost decarbonisation strategy.
Just very finally, because we're about to run out of time, if I can put you all on the spot and ask you a policy-based question, but it's related to that last point. And just using your knowledge and experience around behaviour and usage of the occupant, would you favour incentive and nudging and financial stimulus, or do we just have to mandate the able-to-pay sector to get to these higher standards? So I'm going to put you all on the spot for a slightly political question.
My only thought is that I don't think we're at a stage where there are definitive right ways to do this. I'm imagining a world of a range of heating systems, a range of choices of what are done, but we're certainly imagining, and we've a large part of our budget of our evaluation is about thinking about behavioural change, thinking about the range of incentives that you would use. So I kind of feel at this point that one should definitely experiment with a range of different techniques to incentivize people. Nudging might be one word for it, but I think it's also about clever financial design, tax breaks and all sorts of things, because there's, particularly for private owners, I think there are huge issues here that have to be addressed, and we have to find fair, reasonably affordable ways to get into that. But I think we should be looking at as wide a range of mechanisms of doing it and looking all around the world to see how that can be done, and see how. So I think I'm a large part of the work we're going to do, much is going to be exactly in that space.
Yeah, Darren?
So I would distinguish between operational behaviours, so your day-to-day behaviours and your investment behaviours, and between owner-occupiers and landlords. So nudging tends to target day-to-day operational behaviours, and I think the impact of those kinds of strategies is relatively modest, and people tend to revert back to prior behaviours. I would absolutely support what Ken said, that we need fairly well targeted instruments to financially incentivise investments, but they would tend to probably target more owner-occupiers. I think where we need some kind of imagination is to figure out what sorts of regulatory intervention might be put in place to incentivise private landlords in particular to invest in their stocks, because they're going to be passing on the benefits to their landlords essentially. And so here I would, so I used to live in Switzerland. I lived there for a few years. And in Switzerland, a private landlord can only raise the rent above the rate of inflation if they make a material improvement to the quality of the building. And so there, it's a kind of a good example of where you would tie rental increases to some measure to decarbonise the property. I think, perhaps there's scope for being imaginative in that sort of manner.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, and
Gustav, do you want a final?
Yeah, just to add that, I agree with all these points. And one thing we didn't mention is that we also need to look at what happens next in terms of these thermal take-back or rebounds that then can relate to both the investment behaviors, the operational behaviors. And yes, it is important to try to stimulate or to change that behavior so the people, and also yes to add some pressure to a third party that helps to improve the efficiency of the house in general.
Thanks very much. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. I've found that really interesting. From my perspective in the social housing sector, energy efficiency modelling has been one of the biggest barriers to being able to take decisions, and good investment decisions and no regrets decisions. So I'm really interested in what you've had to say today. And Ken, I'm sure that that model is going to provide some really valuable lessons on retrofitting. So that's been a really interesting session. I hope I managed to get everyone's question in. I think I did. And thank you so much to our speakers. That was a really interesting session. And thank you to everyone who contributed today. And stay safe, as they say nowadays. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.